All right, welcome into this evening's Panther-Lair podcast. It's another one of those busy days. I mean, not too busy. One commitment for Pitt on Tuesday. Perfect timing to have a new commitment come in on the day we're taping a podcast. It gives us plenty of things to talk about, right? I was a little bit concerned that the commitment was going to delay past the point of the podcast starting. And, my worst fear, although it would have been interesting to witness, would be if the commitment came through live during the podcast. I don't think that's really happened at all in the history of this podcast. So there's been breaking news in the middle of a podcast. I mean, I've had some things, I get a text message or something like that, but that'll maybe distract me for a few minutes. Cause me to take a break or something. I know, obviously now we do the podcast via live stream, and so things are a little bit more live, obviously. But I know when I would tape the podcast in the past, I would, maybe something would happen. You get a text message or a Twitter alert or something comes through. There's an announcement or some kind of news. I would pause and chase down the news and then, follow up with the podcast after that. We don't have that option here during the live stream, but I'm always wondering, is this going to be the podcast when something happens in the middle of the show as we are recording, as we're taping? And fortunately, it hasn't happened yet. Hopefully it won't happen, although it certainly would make for interesting viewing. And I think people would jump into the live stream, hopefully jump into the live stream and find out about the news. So there was news today. Pitt got a commitment, number 13 for the class of 2021, and it's another running back, Malik Newton, a three-star prospect out of Norfolk, Virginia. He attends Lake Taylor High School in Norfolk, Virginia. He's in the Tidewater area, and just on the basis of what I said just there, there's a lot of things to dig into, a lot of angles to the commitment of Malik Newton, and it's a big one for Pitt. It's a big-time recruit to commit to Pitt. Now, I said he's a three-star prospect. You got to understand how the Rivals.com rating scale works, where, inside 2 stars, 3 stars, 4 stars, there are varying degrees. There's a rating scale, within. I think 3 stars, a 3-star recruit is a 5.5, 5.6, a 5.7. 5.7 on the Rivals rating is the highest possible 3-star. You're one spot below, you're 1 degree below a 4-star prospect. So that's where Malik Newton is right now in terms of recruiting stars and recruiting ranking. Malik Newton, Pitt's newest commitment, is just on the cusp of being a 4-star prospect, and that's a good place to be because if you have a good senior season, you have a good year that you show up and people you have a good year, you got a good chance of moving up into the 4-star range. So that's, on the ranking side. Offer-wise, you got to like what you see out of Malik Newton. I mean, you've got Clemson, you've got Maryland, Nebraska, Penn State, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Virginia Tech, West Virginia, Purdue, Syracuse. You've got a really good group of schools that were after Malik Newton, this prospect out of Virginia. I think South Carolina was in the mix as well. Obviously, Clemson's the big name in there. You get Penn State as a school that was seriously pursuing him. You like seeing Pitt beat some of these schools for a recruit. You ask the question, well, how did they beat these other schools for this recruit for Malik Newton? And you come to another point that I said when I described who this commitment is. He's a commitment out of Norfolk, Virginia, Tidewater area. And this is big because it's another one for Chris Beatty. Chris Beatty was the man for defensive end Trevion Stevenson. You go all the way back to November. The second commitment Pitt got in the class. Rodney Hammond, the running back. Another kid out of a high school in Norfolk. Booker T. Washington in Norfolk. The Tidewater recruit. And then you go forward into this spring. Trevion Stevenson was one of the first recruits to commit this spring. Another one they got was a wide receiver, and that's Miles Alston. Again, another Tidewater prospect. And those are all Chris Beatty's guys. That's 4 guys that Chris Beatty is responsible for out of a class of 13. So you're looking at almost a quarter of the class is Chris Beatty's guys. We've talked about this before. We talked about it when they got Stevenson and Alston to commit. We talked about it in relation to Hammond, and then Beatty's impact on some of the other guys that they've landed. And we talked about it even last spring of 2019, when Beatty got a lot of underclassmen, some of these guys in this current class. I mean, Malik Newton among them, to come and visit during the spring. We said, look, these are guys that Pitt would not usually get on campus during the spring. Some of these top, at the time they were sophomores, some of these top sophomore prospects, Pitt would not usually have a good chance of getting these guys, top sophomore prospects, out of the Tidewater region on campus for unofficial visits in the spring. But they got them up here, and the reason they got them up here was because of Chris Beatty. And the reason they got commitments from these guys was because of Chris Beatty. And I asked Malik Newton, the new running back commitment, about that. I said, what is it about Beatty? How is he able to, what makes him good? What makes him connect with you guys? And he said, look, I mean, one thing is he's from here. He can relate to us. He knows what it's like living here. And so we've got that in common. And I think it's important to have that basis for a relationship. The two offensive linemen Pitt got out of Detroit earlier, Terrence Enos and Brandon Honorable. Both of those guys cited Archie Collins, and the fact that Archie Collins has roots in Detroit, and they were able to connect. And Archie Collins used to be a high school coach in Detroit. Chris Beatty used to be a high school coach in this Tidewater area. He was a head coach at Lansdowne when Percy Harvin was playing there. Number one recruit in the country was playing there for Chris Beatty. And Chris Beatty, as a head coach at Lansdowne, working in the Tidewater area with roots in the Tidewater area, has a lot of connections. And a lot of times in recruiting, it's who you know. There's a lot of factors that go into recruiting. There's a lot of factors that make you effective as a recruiter. Knowing the right guys and being able to, have the right connections is a big deal. And I don't think you can overestimate it. I don't think you should underestimate it. I don't think you can overestimate it. And Beatty's been tapping into those connections and building the relationships. Because, you can have the connections and that helps you get your foot in the door. And then you've got to build those relationships with the recruits, which is what Beatty's been able to do with these 4 kids from the Tidewater area. And it even extends beyond them. You look at Jaden Bradley, the wide receiver from DeMatha. Andre Powell, Pitt's running back coach, he's the number one recruiter for the Maryland, for DeMatha, for that general area. Maryland, D.C. is Andre Powell's area. We've talked about this before, that the Pitt staff is divided up. They've got, each of the assistants has a geographic area. And Beatty, obviously, like I say, is in Virginia. Andre Powell is in D.C., Maryland. He's handling that area. And so he's got a lot to do with Jaden Bradley committing, the wide receiver out of DeMatha. But you can't count out Chris Beatty. The position coach does play a role, some more than others. And Beatty certainly, I think, is one that you would fit into the, you would say he plays more of a role than maybe some of the other position coaches do. And so you look at Jaden Bradley and say, yeah, you're going to give Beatty some credit there, because he was a big part of why Jaden Bradley committed. You go back to last year's class, specifically with Jordan Addison and Jalen Barton, 2 really good receiver prospects. Again, guys who were at that high end of the 3-star range. Both had options, some really good schools after them, and particularly Addison had Notre Dame pushing hard for him throughout the season. Michigan making a hard push throughout the season. Maryland with Mike Loxley, which, you can say what you want about Maryland. With Mike Loxley there, they are a force on the recruiting trail. They're good. And they made a big push for Jordan Addison late in the process. If you don't have Chris Beatty, I don't know if Pitt holds on to Jordan Addison. I don't know. I go back and forth. I don't want to say that they definitely lose him. But I don't know, I'm less confident about Pitt holding on to Jordan Addison, if that was 2 years ago, than if it was last year. And that's not a reflection on Kevin Sherman, Pitt's former receiving coach. It's not about that. It's more a praise of Chris Beatty and the job he's done. So it's with the guys in his geographic region, and it's with the guys that he's recruiting for his position. And that's the recruiting angle of Pitt's newest commitment, Malik Newton. Then there's also the whole fitting into the roster thing. And this is where it gets really interesting with Malik Newton, because we could talk all we want about star rankings and recruiting territories and good recruiters on the staff and this and that. Malik Newton can play. What was that old that Larry Fitzgerald, either ESPN the magazine or Sports Illustrated cover, that was forget 40 times in verticals. Larry Fitzgerald can flat out play. I'm not saying forget 40 times in verticals, and I'm not comparing him to Larry Fitzgerald, but Malik Newton can flat out play. the first thing that stands out about Malik Newton when you put on his film, when you look at his rivals profile, whatever it is, he's a big back. And this isn't necessarily something the Pitt has loaded up on in its recruiting. Todd Sibley is a bigger back. I mean, Todd Sibley and A.J. Davis are both bigger backs. They both top 200 pounds. Sibley's shorter. He's about 5'9", whereas Davis is pushing 5'10", 5'11". Malik Newton's checking in at, 5'11", 6'10", 225 pounds. He's a big boy. He's a big running back. And he's not just out there plotting. He's knocking guys over, but he's also running away from guys. And that's how he ends up with 2,000 yards and 37 touchdowns this past season, which is what he did in leading his team to a state championship and getting named the Tidewater Player of the Year for the second year in a row. You can go on and on with superlatives. I forget what Abe Goldblatt Tidewater Player of the Year, I think is the name of the award. It's been handed out since 1982. And there's some talented players in the Tidewater region, some very good football played in the Tidewater area. Only 3 guys have won that award twice. Percy Harvin in 2004 and 2005, who was the number 1 recruit in the country. Another guy named, I think, Kevin Whaley, he went to Minnesota. He was like a year or two later. He won it back-to-back. And Malik Newton has won this award back-to-back. He's really good. He's a really good back, and he's got an element, like I say, with his size that Pitt doesn't really have on the roster. 2 years ago, they signed Vincent Davis and Daniel Carter. You talk about thunder and lightning combination. I mean, Daniel Carter was so much thunder, they moved him to fullback. So that's where he's going to be playing, and it'll be interesting to see what he contributes to the offense this year. He'll be the biggest back on the roster, but he's not going to be playing tailback. So what do they, how do they get the ball in his hands? I think there are going to be opportunities to do that, and I think he's got a potential to make some plays. But you've got some other backs to consider, and we'll talk about those guys in a second. None of them has the size that Malik Newton does. I mean, Carter might be the closest comparison, but Newton at 5'11", 6 foot, 225 pounds, is going to come on campus and be the biggest running back, not fullback, but running back on the roster. He's bigger than Rodney Hammond, who's another running back in this class. He's definitely bigger than Vincent Davis, who's 5'8", 175, and bigger than Davis is ever going to get. I hope Vincent Davis never grows to be 5'8", 225, because he's not going to be playing football anymore. No disrespect, Vincent. He's the smaller guy. Israel Abanaconda, an interesting one. He's 5'10", 5'11". He's around that 200-pound range, pushing 200 pounds, a little above 200. It'd be interesting to see what he can get up to. I'm not sure he'll... he might be able to get to 225. I don't know how he's going to carry that weight. Malik Newton already is 225. Now, this is not to say that Malik Newton is a better back than Israel Abanaconda or Vincent Davis or Todd Sibley or A.J. Davis. I try not to do that. There are times where I genuinely believe a recruit might be better than the guys on the current roster. I think Jordan Addison compares very favorably to the wide receivers on Pitt's roster. I really do. And I thought that when he was a recruit, and I think it even more now that he's actually been on campus and working with the team, and you talk to guys around the team, coaches and players, and find out, kind of what their reactions were to seeing him go through workouts and spring practices, the 3 that they held. I think he compares very favorably to the other guys on the roster. But I try not to make those kind of comparisons all too often. I'm going to compare guys. I'm going to compare recruits to the players on the current roster. I try not to go too far overboard and say, well, this guy's already better than that guy. This guy's going to come in and unseat that guy. We do that too much. We do that in the NFL with draft picks, and we definitely do it with recruiting. You got 20 guys coming in, 25 guys coming in. Every one of them is going to be a starter in their freshman year. Why are they still running this third-year starter out there when they've got this freshman who just walked onto campus? Why aren't they giving him a chance? See what he can do. Right? I mean, we always say that kind of thing. I try to shy away from that. And so I'm not sitting here saying Malik Newton's going to be better than any of those guys, but I think he brings a really interesting combination of size and agility at his size. Somebody on the message boards compared him to A.J. Dillon, who's a really good running back in the NFL. I think that's an interesting comparison. And I think he's a unique player for what Pitt has on his roster, and I think he's going to have a really interesting role when he gets on campus. I think there are a dozen different ways to slice this commitment and this news, this development for Pitt's roster and his recruiting class. I think every one of them is good. From Newton's ability his talent, how he fits into the roster, what he can do in this roster, how he can help this running game, what it means for Chris Beatty's recruiting, what it means for the recruiting class overall, how it affects the rankings, the class rankings, which we will bring up right now. I think, every element of this thing is pretty strong for Pitt. This is good news for the Panthers, getting Malik Newton. Yeah, they're right now ranked number 22 in the nation, sitting with 13 commitments. Now, the caveat, of course, with that is that you're looking at quantity affecting things a little bit. Pitt's got 13 commitments. That's a larger class. There are a lot of teams with a lot of commitments right now because this has been the craziest spring in history in terms of early commitments. But 13 commitments is still on the larger side. And so because of that, you're going to have the rankings affected a little bit. But when you add a 5.7 3-star recruit to the class, you're going to get a positive bump. And Newton, instantly is tied, and he's in the top 3 of highest rated recruits in this class. Nakai Johnson from West Mifflin is number 1. He's a 4-star prospect. And then you've got Malik Newton and Terrence Enos, the offensive lineman from Detroit. They're both 5.73 stars, right on the cusp of 4-star status. Like I say, there's a lot of ways you can slice up a commitment and news of a commitment. Sometimes you have to stretch to find a lot of positives, aside from, hey, here's a good player who wants to go to Pitt. I think you can find a lot of positives in the story with Malik Newton committing to the Panthers. So a good ad for Pitt that we see joining the recruiting class. I'm going to get to some of the comments on YouTube, but first we got to open something. I'm a little parched. Crack this one. This is another New Belgium Voodoo Ranger. Voodoo Ranger always has a variety of they've got their basic Voodoo Ranger IPA, and then they put out new ones, seasonals and different lines. I forgot, they've got a name for it, but just different editions, I guess, is one way to say it. I think we had the 1985 last week, the Mango IPA, which is awesome. This is Liquid Paradise, which I don't have the paper that describes what this is. But it's got the skeleton guy, the Voodoo Ranger, lounging, and it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I mean, I haven't had a Voodoo Ranger I didn't like, right? The guava spruce double IPA or whatever that was that I used to drink all the time when I first started getting support from New Belgium and some other brewers here on the podcast. We drank a lot of New Belgium, a lot of Voodoo Ranger then, and certainly this Liquid Paradise IPA is one we're going to enjoy for a while. So go find some New Belgium. In the YouTube comments, we've of course, this is the advantage of the live stream. It's what we always appreciate and always enjoy about having this live stream on YouTube every Tuesday night at 8:30. Is you can get in the comments, you can get in the discussion. Like I'm saying something, and I offer a thought, I offer an opinion, I ask a question. You got a comment on it, or you have a question about it, you want to say something, go for it. And so we jump right in, and Josh Newark says, go back to your conversation with Maurice French as to why Chris Beatty is killing it in recruiting. And yeah, Josh is referencing our Conversations podcast that we put out every Friday, where we have an interview with a former Pitt player, someone connected to Pitt in some way, and we'll have another one of those this Friday. Brief sidetrack: if you didn't listen to last week's interview with Curtis Martin, it's in the podcast feed. Go to iTunes or Apple Music, whatever it's called. Go to Libsyn or Podbean or any of these places. Go to Panther-Lair.com. You can find it there. Listen to the interview with Curtis Martin. It's about a half-hour podcast episode. And that was an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed the discussion with Curtis Martin. I didn't know a lot about Curtis Martin's story. I knew that he played at Pitt and had an NFL Hall of Fame career, but didn't do a lot at Pitt because he got hurt. He only had one 1,000-yard season. He's not in the top 10 in all-time rushers in Pitt history. I knew all that, but I didn't know a lot about his story. And hearing him tell it, man, he really it was outstanding. And it was candid, and it was insightful, and it was a guy who knows that he hasn't always made the best decisions for himself, and he's very honest about that. He said he feels like he cheated Pitt, quote-unquote cheated. That's his word, Pitt, because he didn't take care of his body, and that's why he got hurt as much as he did. And so go check that out. That was an awesome conversation. But really, I don't think we've had a bad one of those. And that's not a brag on my part, because it's the guests. You know what I mean? We've gotten great stuff from Pat Bostic, Lateef Grimm, Scott McKillop, Tyler Palco, Maurice French, Jeff Capel was our guest one time. I mean, those guys have been awesome to talk to. And Curtis Martin was the latest and really the best. And so all those conversation podcasts, I think have been really interesting and enjoyable. I've enjoyed taping them, and I hope you've gotten a chance to check them out and you've enjoyed listening to them. And so that's what Josh Newark is referencing here. He says, go back to your conversation with Maurice French. When we had French on, I asked him about Chris Beatty. I said, what was it about him as a coach? He seems like he's a really good recruiter. Why is he able to relate to recruits? And French really praised him a lot. Said he wished he had another year so he could play with Chris Beatty. And I was kind of surprised by that. I think a lot of guys, particularly after 4 years, they get to a point where they're ready to move on. They're ready to get to the next step in life, particularly if it means playing in the NFL. But when I asked Maurice French if he wished he had another year, because he played 4 seasons, but his first year he didn't play that much. He played cornerback in a game or two, scored 2 touchdowns, dazzling, really nice plays, but totally unnecessary for him to be on the field. And I asked him, do you sometimes wish that you had redshirted that year and then you'd have a 5th year to play? And I mean, he had no hesitation at all. He said, yes, absolutely. I absolutely wish I had been, had another year to play. And it wasn't just that he loved college and he wanted to stick around and be with his friends again. It was about Chris Beatty and Mark Whipple. He wanted to play for those guys again. And, that's a really strong endorsement because you won't find a lot of guys who would say that. Now, maybe it's a different scenario if he ends up getting drafted in the 2nd round or something. Maybe he says, no, I'm good. I'm glad to move on. But, it was it was a strong endorsement from Maurice French of Chris Beatty. And I highly recommend you go back and find that. That podcast is out there. You can find it. It's on, like I say, go to Panther-Lair.com. Go to the podcast feed on iTunes or Apple Music, whatever it is now, and you'll find it out there. It's well worth a listen. Corey Colton says, I can't say I'm complaining about sitting in a backyard here with the Fish live stream on in the background. That plus a few or more beverages is a nice way to start my 3-day weekend. Corey, it's Tuesday, so your 3-day weekend is pretty interesting, my man. But cheers to you. And I appreciate you finding a way to get the Fish live stream and the Panther-Lair podcast on at the same time, because we do go straight head-to-head with the Fish live stream every Tuesday night. So all the Fish, overlapping Fish Head Pit fans have to make a decision. So we appreciate anybody who checks in here. And the good thing about this is we usually finish the podcast on Tuesday night just in time for you to catch like the very end of the first set of the Fish live stream, and then you can jump right into the second set. Grant Nieport says on YouTube, Pitt should try Gerald Drumgoole at tight end. I don't know about all that. I do think that it would have been pretty interesting if DeJuan Blair had played defensive end at Pitt. Give him to Dave Wanstead's defense. Give him to Greg Gattuso. And I think it would have been interesting to see. I think he could have been really, really good as a defensive end. DeJuan Blair, or defensive tackle, eventually probably would have grown into that. But he could have been a beast out there. Dave Bolowitz asks, your discussion last week about the offensive line, is there any chance Jerry Drake will play for Pitt? What caused the exemption? He got hurt. And he had injury problems, medical problems. I mean, he wasn't even dressed for most of the games last season, and that ended his career. I mean, he hung it up. He's done. He's not going to play for Pitt. I don't think you come back from that. I think you make a decision to do that, and it's a way to stay on scholarship and finish your education. But I think Jerry Drake's football career is over. So that's one that was, looked pretty good, and just couldn't stay healthy, apparently. But he got a lot of raves. He came in early with that class of 2017. He enrolled in January and really got a lot of praise from the coaches it looked like there might be a possibility he could be on the, I think he was on the 2 deep as a freshman, and it looked like there was a chance he might get on the field, but couldn't stay healthy. And, that's kind of that story. And you'll have that every now and then, even with talented players. Royce Beacom says Paul Zeiss is having a discussion on the perils of Pitt in the Big East. Those days are gone, and Chris is much more positive. The funny thing about Royce, if you're trying to compare this podcast to Paul Zeiss's show, we actually started the podcast here on Tuesday night a few minutes late because I was a guest on Paul's show, and I had to finish up that segment and then come and get set up the podcast. So I'm running a little bit late, but I was actually on that podcast. It was part of a conversation about Paul and I were having a conversation reminiscing on trips to UConn, trips to cover games where Pitt played at Connecticut in football, because there have been some reports that Connecticut's going to have to drop some sports, some Olympic sports programs, largely because the football program is just a money suck. It's a drain. And there's no reason that Connecticut should be playing independent FBS football. Connecticut should have gone to FCS yesterday or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. When the Big East broke up, when Pitt and Syracuse went to the ACC and Rutgers went to the Big Ten and West Virginia went to the Big 12 and then Louisville ultimately went to the ACC, and the AAC was formed, there was no reason for Connecticut to try to continue holding on. Nobody cared about Connecticut football when Connecticut football was even kind of good. And they definitely don't care now that Connecticut football is terrible. And yeah, it is a cautionary tale, because if Pitt didn't join the ACC, they very well could have been Connecticut. Best case scenario, if you're Pitt and you turn down the ACC, you just stick with the Big East, best case scenario, you end up as Cincinnati. And I'm not entirely convinced that Pitt could operate its football program as well as Cincinnati does. Cincinnati, in terms of hiring head coaches, is a pretty, I don't think you would dispute this, has a better track record than Pitt does over the last 20 years. Taken in totality, you would give the edge to Cincinnati, last 15, 20 years of head coaches they have hired. And I'm not, Cincinnati's been able to stay competitive and relevant despite not being in the Power 5 conferences because they've hired well. And I'm not so sure that Pitt would have fared as well if they had been left out of the ACC realignment. So Pitt would probably have been, football-wise, more likely to go the Connecticut route, although the fan base is stronger for Pitt football than it is for Connecticut football. So that's not entirely a great comparison, but yeah, that's the perils of that whole thing. When people talk about how they wish Pitt didn't go to the ACC or it was a bad move or, it set the basketball program back and hasn't helped football, it kept Pitt football in the Power 5 conferences, which was the most important thing. Michael Cosentino says Malik Newton could be the first player to win the Tidewater Region Player of the Year award 3 times. And that would be quite an accomplishment. You're absolutely right about that, Michael. That is, we talked about how Malik Newton's in a group with Percy Harvin and one other guy of since 1982, players who have won that award twice. And now he's on the verge. If with a big senior season, he could do it 3 times in a row. And it's a very real possibility. They're pretty good. He's in pretty good company, and he's a pretty good player. Josh Newark says, it seems like Pitt is getting wide receivers and running backs that are 4 stars or really close to being 4-star players, but I worry that the offensive line recruits are low 3, high 2-star prospects. If you look at Pitt's offensive line recruits, Terrence Enos is the best one. He's a high 3-star. He's ranked the same as Malik Newton, a 5.7 3-star. Terrence Rankle, the offensive lineman out of Massillon, Washington, is right behind as a 5.6 3-star. And then Brandon Honorable is a low 3-star at 5.5. And then there's Marco Fugar, the 4th offensive line commitment. He's a 2-star prospect right now. Look, Josh, you're going to have to develop your guys. And this is true regardless of their star ranking. You'd like to see these guys have higher stars. I think the offer sheets for Rankle, Honorable, and Enos are all pretty good with varying degrees, Enos having the best. But I think they're all, pretty solid offer sheets. But you're going to have, the offensive line, look, you need to develop your guys at every position. Offensive line more than others, though, I would say, where you're not going to just rely on that natural talent that a guy comes in with, like at running back or a wide receiver, where you still need to coach them up and develop them. I think there's more of that on the offensive line. So you want to get those guys with the natural talent for sure. The talent that shines through, that's so obvious that they end up with a high ranking. But you're also, even if you get those guys with a high ranking, you're going to have to do a good job coaching them up, or else you'll waste it. So, I mean, look, ultimately I agree, Josh. You want to get 4-star recruits and 5-star recruits at every position on the team. Right now, I think they are doing a good job of bringing in some quality skill position players on the offensive line, or on the offense. And then you have to hope, I guess, if you're Pitt, that they evaluate it properly and can develop well, the guys on the offensive line. Scott Lynch asks, do you think a tight end, he says, do you think tight ends catch more than 40 receptions in 2020 or 2021? Now, I'm not asking I'm not sure, Scott, if you are asking me if I think a single tight end has 40 catches or if the tight ends together have 40 catches. I'm going to guess you mean a single tight end. And yeah, I think if he stays healthy and plays 13 games, Lucas Kroll will catch more than 40 passes. Wow, man, that's a lot. You can have a thought in your head, and you speak it out loud, and you say, ugh, I just don't know. 40 catches over 13 games. That's only like 3 catches a game, on average. And you get like a 6-catch game or a 5-catch game. Look, there are going to be options out there, guys to throw the ball to. I don't think there will be another tight end who touches Kroll or comes close to Kroll in terms of receptions or targets. So he's really going to be competing with Taysir Mack and Shockey Jacques-Louis and Jordan Addison and Jalen Barton and Trey Tipton and whoever else gets into the mix at wide receiver. That's going to be Lucas Kroll's main competition for catches. But I think they're going to get him the ball a lot. I think he'll get close to 40 receptions if he doesn't top that number. And again, he's got to stay healthy and play 13 games. CJF02389 with a username that just rolls right off the tongue says, what's the word on Paris Brown, a former 3-star kid out of Georgia who came in as a walk-on, split time between running back and cornerback? Any word on possibly going on scholarship? Paris Brown was really interesting. I think it was last summer he decided to commit. He was a 3-star prospect on Rivals.com. He had some scholarship offers. They went away, or he didn't get a chance to take advantage of them for whatever reason. And he ended up going to Pitt as a walk-on running back, moved to cornerback or safety. I think he's still at defensive back. I would need to see him show up on the 2-deep and contribute on special teams before I could, really make a guess at what his chances are of going on scholarship. I mean, based on what he's done thus far, you can't really, you're not going to put him on scholarship, but there's plenty of time to get there. Let's see. Calvin Ma says, with all these running backs that Pitt has recruited, will there be another George Aston type opening up a hole? He was exciting to watch blowing up people. Look, I don't know if there's another George Aston in the world. That old quote about the Grateful Dead. Wow, we had a Fish and a Grateful Dead reference on this podcast. Where are we going? What has quarantine done to us? That old quote about the Grateful Dead. They're not the best at what they do. They're the only ones at what they do. George Aston wasn't the best at what they do, or what he did. George Aston wasn't the best at what he did. He was the only one at what he did. Nobody else did what George Aston did. Nobody else is scoring those touchdowns against Clemson. Nobody else is a 10-touchdown fullback, with 5 rushing and 5 receiving, catching shovel passes and all that stuff that he did in Matt Canada's offense in 2016 and blowing guys up the way he did in 2017 and 2018. That video of the 99-yard run or whatever it was that Quadri Olson had in 2018 against Virginia Tech, however long that big, long touchdown run was. Watch George Aston's block on that run. It's dominating, it's devastating, and it springs the run for the touchdown. It's an incredible block and led to an incredible run. I don't know if there is another George Aston out there to find. And I don't know if they have one on this roster. I think it's going to be interesting to see what Daniel Carter becomes. I have a feeling he might be more of a guy they try to get the ball to in unique ways. And that would be, I think that would be interesting to see. but I don't know how he'll develop as a blocker. I mean, he was a running back. He was a tailback in high school. How is he going to develop as a blocker in college? That'll remain to be seen. But he's a big guy, so he's got some body to throw around. Royce Beacom says Malik Newton has offers from Clemson and Penn State. Yep, you're right about that, Royce. And 24/7 says Pitt has 9 running backs on the roster with Newton. I don't know. Maybe if you're counting walk-ons. Right now, they have 4 scholarship running backs on the roster. A.J. Davis, Vincent Davis, Todd Sibley, and Israel Bonaconda. After this season, they lose one of those guys, A.J. Davis, and they're bringing in 2. 3 plus 2 is 5. Scholarship running backs. Daniel Carter, Rashad Wheeler, if you want to include those guys, they're fullbacks. Tailbacks, running backs, guys that you're going to be, lining up in the I formation or next to the quarterback and handing the ball off to them all the time and stuff. They've got 4 on the roster this year, and they're currently projected to have 5 next year. Scholarship guys. That's what I'm talking about. Jam ST174 says it has a Voodoo Ranger variety pack. Good stuff. I think this Liquid Paradise IPA that I've been drinking came in a variety pack as well. It is good. You're right. Scott Lynch gave us the the description of the Liquid Paradise IPA using Mosaic, Incognito, Azaka, and Cascade hops. Liquid Paradise boasts a melange of tropical notes to create a delicately bitter and extremely aromatic IPA. That's a good way. That's a good way to describe it. It is delicately bitter. CJF OT 02389 says, what do you think would happen with the Notre Dame game if they decide to only play the conference schedule? Would each school that plays Notre Dame make the decision whether or not to play that game? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, like, if the entirety of the ACC says we're not playing any non-conference games, we're only playing 7 games this year, 8 games this year. What happens with games against Notre Dame? I don't know the answer to that, man. I don't. There's so many questions about what the season could look like that I just don't have answers for. I will say this. It seems like in the last week or so, the shift has been more toward plans for limited capacity games than a limited schedule. Right? It seems like you see more of, college administrators, conference commissioners talking about playing games with 50% capacity or 20,000 people or 30,000 people as opposed to 70,000 or 60,000 or 50,000. That's what we've seen more of, because for a week or two it was schedule variety. You know what I mean? Scheduling alternatives and how to play the season with limited games. And that was like for a week or two, that was the big hubbub, and sources and the occasional conference commissioner, the occasional university president or athletic director would make a comment along those lines. And we heard about, if some schools decide they're not playing at all, then, other schools in their conference might play a home and home to make up the spot on their schedule. Or maybe conferences could play an abbreviated season and just play conference games or something along those lines. But I feel like it's shifted in the last week and a half, maybe even 2 weeks. I feel like it's shifted to talking more about adjusted attendance and limited capacity in these venues. And so I don't feel like we're talking as much about an 8-game season as we are talking about a 12-game season with 20,000 people socially distanced, can't really say testing because I don't even know what that would look like. But I feel like we're shifting that way, which, you can speak for yourself. I would prefer limited capacity games, 12 of them. I would prefer that over full capacity 8 games. I don't think full capacity is going to happen. You know what I mean? I think it's going to be limited capacity in whatever, however many games they play, whether they play 8 or whether they play 12. We got here. Joshua Lobig says, we talk about Naquan Brown yet. He's been very active on Twitter today, and there's 4 Virginia recruits coming here. Yeah, Naquan Brown's an interesting one. I'm going to bring up his profile here on Rivals.com. Sorry, I didn't have that open. He's a 4-star defensive end out of Virginia, though. He's out of that same region, that same area that we're talking about with these guys who Pitt, is after, who Chris Beatty has gotten Pitt involved with and made Pitt a serious contender for. And they're in that conversation with Naquan Brown. If I could find his rival's profile here, I just want to give you a little info because, if you don't know what we're talking about. Let me see here. We list him as an outside linebacker. That's why I couldn't find him. He's from Virginia Beach. What high school is he at? Ocean Lakes. He's actually a teammate of Miles Alston. That's right. I forgot about that. I knew there was another angle that I wasn't thinking of. Miles Alston, the Pitt commit, is a teammate with Naquan Brown, 4-star. He's listed as an outside linebacker. I think he's a defensive end. He's a big-time prospect. And it's a long shot for Pitt, but at this point, with the way Chris Beatty's recruiting, I'm not going to rule them out for anyone that he's after. Particularly not when a guy has connections to Pitt through another commitment, which is a teammate of his, and then obviously the Beatty connection as well. I'm not going to rule them out for anyone. So yeah, we're keeping an eye on Naquan Brown. I think he's going to wait a while before he commits, and that gives Pitt a better chance to make their case. Mark Cerny says, you mentioned the recruiting class and quantity, but there's also quality. With that in mind, what are Pitt's chances with Elliot Donald? Elliot Donald, of course, 4-star defensive lineman at Central Catholic. He's got a famous last name, and it sure enough is his uncle, Aaron Donald. I think Pitt's in really good shape with Elliot Donald. I've said that for a long time, even before certain incidents that made even more people believe they were in good shape with that Pitt was in good shape with Elliot Donald. I think Pitt's got a really good chance. They just need to keep on it. I think that Elliot Donald wants to take some official visits, and that may be delaying his decision. But I think when it all comes down to it, ultimately he'll have. I think Pitt will end up getting Elliot Donald. Let's see. CJF02389 says, is Grant Kerrigan a legit option at tackle this season? He's a big kid who can move, possibly Brian O'Neill 2.0. Before COVID knocked out spring practice. Will he have time to show enough to get on the 2-deep? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what to expect out of Grant Kerrigan after moving from tight end. I don't think he moves as well as Brian O'Neill. Just my sort of layman observations and scouting. I don't think he moves as well. I think Brian O'Neill was a specimen, and Grant Kerrigan, I think, is a good athlete, particularly for his size. It'll be interesting to see how big he is when they get back at it this summer, and particularly once they get to training camp. It would be interesting to see what kind of weight he has put on. Can he make a run at the 2-deep? I think it's possible, although I think it got a little bit less likely with the addition of Keldrick Wilson, the graduate transfer offensive tackle. So I'm not sure what to expect out of Grant Kerrigan. He's a redshirt junior this year. He's not out of time. He's got 2 years left. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what he not sure what he will do. It's an interesting question. Nicholas Temperio, didn't Pitt have a chance to go to the Big 12 before the ACC offer? That sounds vaguely familiar. I think there was talk about that. I think the Big 12, you remember things really, one of the first big moves that happened way back when was Nebraska leaving the Big 12 for the Big 10. And then there was talk about, and then you had, Missouri you had Texas A&M leave the Big 12 for the SEC. And there was talk about Texas potentially bolting to the Pac-12. Do you remember that? There was like this whole crisis, and the Big 12 was scrambling on how they were going to get the numbers, and they added TCU. And yeah, I think there was some talk about it. I don't know if they had an offer per se. I definitely don't think it would have made sense for Pitt to go to the Big 12. It would have been interesting, but not really. It would have been terrible for the rest of us. You know what I mean? Those of us who cover the game or people who like to go to the game. It would have been pretty bad because those trips would be brutally awful, and it wouldn't be a lot of driving trips like you have in Virginia and Virginia Tech and Syracuse and really even Duke and North Carolina. You can make those in drives. It would have been pretty bad to have to. It would be pretty bad to have to go everywhere in the Big 12, other than West Virginia. That'd be a good one to add back in. But yeah, if you give me the option of the ACC and the Big 12, look, the best destination for Pitt here I am about to go on this tangent. The best destination for Pitt is the Big Ten. That's the conference Pitt should be in. Unless you're going to give me the old Big East, Pitt should be in the Big Ten. And I was reminded of this, not this past season. I mean, to some extent this past season, but really 2017 and 2018. I think it hit me in 2018 as I was driving across Ohio and driving into Indiana to go to the Notre Dame game. Notre Dame's not in the Big Ten. I acknowledge that. But as I was driving through Ohio and Indiana, that's the heart of Big Ten country. And I'm driving through Big Ten country, and I get out of the car, and I'm walking through the parking lot of Notre Dame. And again, Notre Dame's not in the Big Ten, but culturally, it is. Culturally, it is in the Big Ten. Just the vibe of the people and the atmosphere of the place. And I'm not talking about the Notre Dame mystique. I just, the area, it felt different, and it felt more appropriate for Pitt than when I was driving to Chapel Hill, or a few weeks later or a month or so later when I drove to Wake Forest, or when you've gone to games at Duke, even Virginia and Virginia Tech. Going into the South is not, the South and the Midwest are different, and if you want to call along, Atlantic coast, you want to call Mid-Atlantic or whatever you want to say, the South and the Midwest are different regions of the country, obviously. And where does Pittsburgh fit? What region does Pittsburgh fit in better? Culturally? Just in terms of the people? It's better in the Midwest. And I felt that in 2017 when I went to the game at Penn State, last year the game at Penn State. But that's just, I'm comfortable with that drive. I drive that way. I live in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Or I don't live in Bloomsburg. I grew up in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'll drive back there to visit friends and family and whatnot. And so I'm comfortable with that drive going out on 22 and 99 and 80 and all that stuff. So it just feels, maybe it's just me, it just feels more natural. It feels more at home. The conference Pitt should have ultimately gotten into, the conference that would have made the most sense, that would have fit the best, that would have provided the best rivalries and the best opponents, is the Big Ten. That, for whatever reason, wasn't an option. So Pitt took the best option that was available, which is the ACC, which is a great option. Don't get me wrong. It's a great conference. It's a good place to be. And it's sure as heck better than being not in one of these Power 5 conferences. But the Big Ten would have been better. I wasn't going to go down that. I didn't mean to go off on that tangent, but here we are. I kind of like this. The podcast with the live stream. We just we float around on topics sometimes. So there you go. You had it. You got my Big Ten rant. CJFO2389. What are the odds that Wendell Davis, Brandon George, or AJ Roberts gives Chase Pine a run for the starting middle linebacker job? Seems like they were grooming Wendell Davis for the position going into this year. Yeah, Wendell Davis has been playing middle linebacker at Pitt, ever since he got to Pitt. That's his spot. I think Brandon George has potential to play there, although he could also be an outside guy. AJ Roberts is a middle linebacker. Chase Pine is a redshirt senior, and he's got experience playing middle linebacker. He's practiced that position a lot. He's played that position in games. I think he holds on to the starting job. That's my, that's my opinion, just based on what he's done and kind of what the coaches have said and what they, what they seem to be gearing up for is Chase Pine. So my assumption is that Chase Pine will be the starting middle linebacker, and probably play there all season. Now I do think they will rotate. I think they'll have different guys play in there, whether it's Wendell Davis or Brandon George or AJ Roberts. I think guys will get snaps in that position because they'll try and rotate their linebackers and keep them fresh. But I think Chase Pine will be the one getting the bulk of the reps. Josh Newark asks, can you explain Pitt's deal with the marketing guru today and what it means in simple terms? Sure. So this is, let me find his name, Jeremy Darlow. Runs a company, I think it's just called Darlow. And he's, I wish I had the language right in front of me. I don't have the press release pulled up. But marketing, brand engagement, brand, establishing brands. The key is this, All right. Pitt hired him to bring him in to work with the student athletes. The NCAA is close to or has decided to or recommended that they're going to or seems headed toward allowing student athletes to profit from their image and their likeness and their names. What this guy will do is help the student athletes, the football players, learn how to do that and how to best maximize the opportunities they have in front of themselves. He's got deals with other schools. I think Georgia Tech is one. I think Maryland is another. I don't have the full list in front of me. But this Jeremy Darlow and his company will assist in that regard. And I actually hope to learn a little bit more about him and what he does and what he plans to do for Pitt in the very near future. Hopefully this week we'll get a little more clarity on the situation. But Pitt announced it on Tuesday, a partnership with Jeremy Darlow to help, like I say, to help the student athletes understand about establishing a brand. They're going to have an opportunity to profit off this, and this is a way for Pitt to help them professionally approach it. Let's see here what other questions we have, because we're almost filled up our whole hour, and I had 5 other topics I was going to get to, but that's good to save some things for next week. Let's see. CJF 02389. You got a lot of questions this week, my man. I like it. Thoughts on the cornerback depth? Marquez Williams probably best suited for slot duty. Could Judson Tallender, AJ Woods, or even Rashad Battle be expected to play reasonably well outside of pressed into duty? You've got Jason Pinnock and Damari Mathis. Those are going to be your top 2. But yeah, you're right. There's questions about the depth behind them. I think AJ Woods will be a good player. I think AJ Woods will be on the 2 deep. I think AJ Woods will get snaps and get playing time in a rotation with Mathis and Pinnock. The question is really going to be Judson Tallender and Marquez Williams. How are those guys going to fit in? Tallender really hasn't played on defense at all. Williams has played a little bit. I don't think they would just use Williams on the slot, as you're suggesting. I think his playing time would be outside, lining up at cornerback. I think they expect their corners to play corner. There is kind of almost like a nickel back defensive position. They bring in like a third safety usually and put them over the slot. Sort of. I mean, that's kind of how it works. It functioned in different ways, almost like a 3-4 sometimes, where that extra defensive back, that extra safety is lined up is almost like an outside linebacker position, but it's kind of over the slot. I think, anyway, that guy I think is going to be Eric Hallett. I think, he played that role last year. I think he'll play that role again this year. And so Williams, I think, will be in the competition at cornerback. And I think, with Judson Tallender and AJ Woods, I don't think the freshmen should be needed. Rashad Battle or Hunter Sellers or Javonte Royal, those guys that they brought in, they shouldn't need them this year. I think you're going to look for Pinnock and Mathis and then some rotational duty from Woods, Williams, and or Tallender. Some combination of those guys. Probably 2 out of those 3 in the mix there. Let's see what else we got. The real questions in here. Let's see. Corey Colton disagrees about going to the Big Ten. Couldn't disagree more. Would be a slightly better Northwestern. Maybe. But right now you're a slightly better Virginia, right? I mean, that's basically, Northwestern has had some successful seasons. I think Pitt's program has a greater potential for success than Northwestern. For a variety of reasons. I think that, and it's not, I don't want to say it's not about where Pitt could have the most success. I think it's about where Pitt fits best. And in my opinion, in my view, Pitt fits in the Big Ten. When you go to games, and I'm not saying I dislike going to games in Durham or Chapel Hill or Wake Forest or, even down to Miami or Charlottesville or Blacksburg. I like going to those places, but I don't know. It just, playing against Ohio State and Michigan and Northwestern and Wisconsin and Indiana and Illinois and then traveling to those places and going to Penn State, hell, even going to Piscataway, or maybe going to Maryland. With Maryland being the furthest south you would go, that seems to feel more representative of who Pittsburgh is, where Pittsburgh is, and how it fits in. And I'm talking about the city, not just the university. I'm talking about the city. I think it fits better as a Midwestern city than it fits as a Southern city. And I think the Atlantic Coast Conference is a Southern conference, whereas the Big Ten is a Midwestern conference. And as a fit, it just seems to fit better. And I think I would like those road trips better too. But that's just me. I always get a little bit sidetracked in thinking about road trips and things like that, how I would want to travel and that sort of thing. Now, make sure you check out, of course, we have this podcast that we release on Wednesdays. Make sure you check out on Friday. We have another conversation podcast coming up with someone who spent a lot of time at Pitt, a lot of history with the University of Pittsburgh Athletic Department, and probably not someone you actually know about. I would wager to guess that a small percentage of listeners to this podcast know who this person is. And so it's going to be interesting for you to hear from them. I think you're going to be interested to hear what they have to say just about the history of Pitt athletics over the last 30, 40 years on a lot of different levels. And I think it's going to be a really interesting podcast. Maybe not it's different. It's going to be different from what you heard from Curtis Martin and some of the other people we've talked to. This podcast here on this Friday is going to be really different. So keep an eye out for that conversation podcast on Friday morning. Of course, Friday afternoon or later, also on Friday morning, we'll have the 321 column on Panther-Lair.com. You should go to the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Well, I mean, and it's no disrespect to anyone else who covers Pitt, but I feel pretty confident that, we cover Pitt as well as anyone, if not better. I think we, football, basketball, recruiting, we have a lot of coverage there at Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. And we're hitting it hard on the basketball recruiting coverage. We got a lot of stuff about Malik Newton committing to Pitt. On the football recruiting side, we've got football team coverage. We got basketball team coverage. And then, of course, we have message boards, the best online community of Pitt sports fans on the internet. And if you're a Pitt fan, you want to talk about Pitt sports, go to the website that has the best Pitt sports coverage and then talk about it on the best Pitt sports message boards. It's pretty simple equation to put together. So Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Nicholas Temperio is a great point. Make sure you hit like right here on the Panther-Lair.com YouTube page. We want to keep rolling those numbers up. We want to get the likes up on the old Panther-Lair YouTube channel. So thank you for the reminder on that one, Nicholas. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Laircom. Saturday mornings, 8 a.m. on 93.7 The Fan. We have the Panthers Insider Show. Make sure you check that out. We would appreciate that. It's always fun to talk a little Pitt sports on the radio airwaves. So you've got, you listen to the radio all week. They sometimes talk about Pitt, sometimes don't. Well, we spend a whole hour, 8 a.m. on Saturday mornings, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., and all we talk about is Pitt sports. So if you want a little Pitt sports talk on the radio, tune in then. We'll be talking about this latest commitment. We'll be talking about Pitt's running back room because I wanted to talk about that tonight. We'll be talking about a bunch of other stuff, retired numbers, and I got a bunch of topics on my head. Maybe I'll get into the Big Ten rant again because that's always fun. I do that one once a year or so. At least I have for the past couple years. Maybe we'll bring that one up. So check that out. 8 a.m. Saturday mornings on 93.7 The Fan. We'll be back for another podcast next week, Tuesday night, 8:30 p.m. right here on YouTube, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Check that out. Listen to the podcast. We appreciate that. We appreciate everybody who was in the comments this week. We love all the questions and conversation. It's fun. We sit down. We talk a little Pitt sports. We take our minds off everything else that's going on in the world, and we talk a little Pitt sports. You can't beat that. And we drink. Get a little Liquid Paradise IPA. New Belgium, Voodoo Ranger. They will not lead you astray. Check it out. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks for everybody in the comments. Go check out the website, Panther-Lair.com. And, we will talk to you again next week. Have a great week, everybody.